El Nino is a natural climate phenomenon that alters global weather patterns. It is marked by warmer-than-average sea surface temperatures in the central and eastern Pacific Ocean near the equator. It fuels flooding to the Americas, tropical storms to the Pacific, and brings droughts to many other parts of the world, including southern Africa. El Niño's effects are varied, causing storms and flooding in some regions and droughts elsewhere. El Nino has a significant impact on food inflation, as it disrupts agricultural production and supply chains. According to Bloomberg economics modeling, previous El Niños added 3.9 percentage points to non-energy commodity prices and 3.5 points to oil. They also hit growth to gross domestic product, especially in vulnerable countries like Brazil, Australia, and India. For example, in Chile, El Nino could trigger heavy rains, which could restrict access to the mines that supply almost 30% of the world's copper. Lower production and delayed shipments will affect the price of the metal used in goods like computer chips, cars, and home appliances. Or consider China, where sweltering temperatures are already killing livestock and stretching power grids. Drought last summer prompted officials to shut off power to many factories for nearly 2 weeks, disrupting supplies for manufacturing giants like Apple and Tesla. Scientists believe El Niño's weather-changing effects will be really strong over the next year or so. They are concerned it could cause new record-high global temperatures and exacerbate the effects of climate change. Earlier this month, researchers at the EU's Copernicus Earth Observation Unit saw global surface air temperatures rise 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels for the first time. This is the limit that world leaders agreed to put on global warming at the 2015 Paris Climate Summit. El Nino is therefore a major challenge for food inflation and CPI, as it threatens new levels of economic destruction and social unrest. The world needs to be prepared with contingency plans and adaptation measures to cope with its consequences. El Nino is a natural climate phenomenon that alters global weather patterns by warming up the sea surface temperatures in the Pacific Ocean near the equator. It occurs every few years and lasts for several months, bringing floods, droughts, storms, and heat waves to different parts of the world. But how does El Nino affect global inflation, especially food prices and non-energy commodity prices? One of the main effects of El Nino is that it disrupts the normal patterns of rainfall and temperature across the globe. This has a direct impact on crop production and food supply, especially in regions that depend on monsoon rains or tropical agriculture. For example, El Nino can cause droughts in Australia, Indonesia, India, Brazil, and southern Africa, reducing the output of wheat, rice, sugar, coffee, and corn. On the other hand, El Nino can also cause excessive rainfall and flooding in parts of South America, North America, and Southeast Asia, damaging crops and infrastructure. These weather shocks can lead to food shortages and higher food prices in both domestic and international markets. According to a study by the World Bank, El Nino events can increase global food prices by an average of 4% in the short term and 8% in the long term. The impact is more pronounced for certain commodities that are more sensitive to El Nino, such as rice, wheat, sugar, and palm oil. For instance, during the 2015-16 El Nino episode, which was one of the strongest on record, global rice prices rose by 14%, wheat prices by 9%, sugar prices by 32%, and palm oil prices by 18%. Higher food prices can have a significant effect on global inflation, especially in developing countries where food accounts for a large share of consumer spending. For example, food items have 39% weight in India's Consumer Price Index, CPI, which is the main measure of inflation for the Reserve Bank of India. An intense El Nino that severely disrupts the monsoon could push inflation up by 15 to 20 basis points by boosting food prices. Similarly, in China, food has a 30% weight in the CPI basket, and an El Nino-induced drought could raise inflation by 10 to 15 basis points. But food is not the only commodity that is affected by El Nino. Non-energy commodities such as metals and minerals are also influenced by the climate phenomenon through its impact on supply and demand. For example, El Nino can reduce the supply of copper from Chile and Peru, which are the world's largest producers of the metal. This can drive up copper prices and inflation in countries that import copper or use it as an input for manufacturing. On the other hand, El Nino can also reduce the demand for commodities such as coal and iron ore from countries that experience lower economic activity due to adverse weather conditions. According to Bloomberg economics modeling, El Nino has a marked impact on global inflation, adding 3.9 percentage points to non-energy commodity prices and 3.5 points to oil prices. The effect is more pronounced during strong El Nino episodes such as those in 1982–83 and 2015. The economic impacts of previous El Nino seasons have often continued even after the most extreme weather conditions have passed. Following El Nino in 1982–83, the financial effects were felt for another half-decade, totaling some $4.1 trillion. Therefore, El Nino is not only a natural phenomenon but also an economic one that can have significant implications for global inflation and growth. As scientists predict that El Nino will become more frequent and intense due to climate change, policymakers and businesses need to be prepared for its potential consequences and take measures to mitigate its negative effects. El Nino is a climatic phenomenon that occurs when the surface temperature of the Pacific Ocean rises above normal levels. It affects the weather patterns across the globe, including India's monsoon. The monsoon is a seasonal wind system that brings rainfall to most parts of India from June to September. It is crucial for India's agriculture, which depends largely on rain-fed irrigation. El Nino can weaken the monsoon winds and reduce the rainfall over India. This can have a negative impact on the production of kharif crops, such as paddy, groundnut and pulses, which are sown in June and harvested in September or October. These crops account for about half of India's food grain output and are important for food security and rural incomes. A lower kharif output can lead to a shortage of food supply and a rise in food prices. Food inflation is a major component of India's Consumer Price Index, CPI, which measures the change in the cost of living for households. Food items have a weight of 39.06% in India's CPI. A higher food inflation can push up the overall inflation and erode the purchasing power of consumers. According to some estimates, an intense El Nino can increase food inflation by 50 to 60 basis points, BPS, or 0.5 to 0.6 percentage points. 1 basis point is 1/100%. For example, if food inflation is 4% without El Nino, it can rise to 4.5 to 4.6% with El Nino. This can also affect the headline inflation, which is the CPI inflation that the Reserve Bank of India, RBI, targets at 4% with a tolerance band of 2 to 6%. The RBI considers inflation as one of the key factors for setting interest rates. A higher inflation can prompt the RBI to raise interest rates to curb demand and control prices. However, this can also slow down economic growth and investment. Therefore, the RBI has to balance between growth and inflation while deciding on monetary policy. The RBI has said that it expects inflation to ease to 5.1% in FY24, but it has also flagged El Nino as a challenge to its efforts. The RBI has said that it will continue to monitor the inflation situation and take appropriate measures if needed. The government can also intervene to mitigate the impact of El Nino on food inflation by taking supply-side measures, such as releasing buffer stocks of wheat and rice, imposing stock limits on traders, cutting import duties on certain items, and providing subsidies or incentives to farmers and consumers. The government can also prepare a contingency plan in case of a below-normal monsoon by ensuring adequate water management, crop diversification, crop insurance, and drought relief measures. The impact of El Nino on India's monsoon, food production and CPI depends on various factors, such as the intensity and duration of El Nino, the spatial distribution and variability of rainfall, the availability of irrigation facilities, the level of food stocks and reserves, the global commodity prices, and the policy responses by the government and the RBI. Therefore, it is important to keep a close watch on the weather forecasts and indicators of El Nino and take timely actions to minimize its adverse effects on India's economy and society.